Hey! Well, like I said last week, these are really interesting times from Honda at the moment. Whilst I was sort of patting myself on the back about the release of my speculative video on the possibility of a Honda 404 on Friday, Honda India released the CB500, a bored-out version of the CB350 Highness, which for the moment at least is a regional model built specifically for the Indian market. Now, I've built up a few contacts in the motorcycle industry running this channel over the last 10 or 11 years, not from Honda, but it's taken me all week really to get some opinions from people about this. Obviously Honda hasn't released what his plans are, but the general consensus of opinion by those sort of industry contacts that I have is that this is part of a Scorched Earth strategy that Honda is employing to put Royal Enfield back in its box. Now, I'll say it again, as I do in all of these videos, this is a speculative video. What I hadn't bargained for is obviously the fact that the Smug Brigade doesn't know what speculate means, so I'll put that up on the screen for you now. I mean, I've only got the English language at my disposal, I don't know what else to do really. Now, as it stands at the moment, the CB500 is an India-only model, but it's a very important India-only model. I'll enlarge on that as the video goes on, but what you've got to remember is that the CB500 in India and the GB500S for the States, Europe and the UK might not necessarily be the same bike. Now, I actually found out about the release of this bike through the comments on that video, and since then a lot of people have politely asked me if I will give my views on it. That's what I'm doing today. But over the last year, 18 months, I've released 2 or 3 speculative videos about the Honda trademark registration of the GB500S designation for the US, Europe and the UK, not India. Now, I always make it clear at the beginning of these videos that they are speculative videos, but immediately the Smug Brigade jumped into those other videos telling me, oh, how wrong I was, and with my sanctimonious tone had got it completely wrong, and that this video hasn't aged very well, has it? Well, actually, so far, yeah, it has, because it's still an open game. I haven't been proven correct yet, but nor have I been proven wrong. The CB500, as I've said, is an India-only model. The context of those videos was the release of the GB500S in Europe, America and the United Kingdom, not India. Now, the Smug Brigade are assuming that because this model's been brought out in India, we're going to see exactly the same scenario as we saw with the GB350S. But from the launch of the CB350 Highness in India to its eventual release in the UK, that was quite convoluted. It took 4 years. The reason being that, first of all, they had to introduce it to the Japanese market to see if it would take. Now, I've made videos on this subject, or I've made a video on this subject quite recently. If you're going to introduce a motorcycle to the Indian market, it's got to be made 100% in India. You can't import tyres and braking systems and electronics from other countries because of the protectionist laws in India. Otherwise you have to pay a punitive 10% tax on each of those components, which pushes the price of your product up to the point of unaffordability. That's why it's there. It's a protectionist law to create that situation so that if a foreign manufacturer wants to sell his product in India, he has to manufacture it, including the entire production chain from raw materials in India, to keep it economically viable for sale in that country. Now, if you then want to manufacture that model in India and export it to other markets, that creates some quality control issues and compatibility problems. A prime example is the tyres. You know, Royal Enfield used the Seat and the MRF tyres. For the most part, these are a hard compound tyre suitable for use in tropical areas, so you can export them to places like Australia and New Zealand and they'll perform okay. But if you bring them to a temperate climate like Japan, where it can get very cold, and the UK and Europe, they're borderline dangerous because that hard compound doesn't warm up and doesn't give the grip that the customer expects. And you run into similar problems with the braking systems and similar problems with a lot of the electronics. So in order for Honda to preserve its reputation in the international market, it had to move the production of the GB350S from India to Japan so that it could be built to a specification that its customers have a right to expect. So if you're going to see a similar scenario play out with the new CB500, it turning into the GB500S, a similar scenario is going to have to play out. Production is going to have to be moved to either Japan or Thailand, and we're going to see the same sort of time span. They might be able to do it a little bit quicker because they've been through it now with the GB350, so they know what they're doing. But there is another problem. This is an air-cooled engine, and in order to keep it within emissions controls, now I did say to one viewer in a comment on Friday's video, it's unlikely that it's going to meet the UK and EU emissions regulations. Actually, I've been told it does, but that's why they've had to pull its teeth. It's only 27 brake horsepower. Not much of an increase, not the sort of an increase that you would expect for a 500cc bike over a 350. Top-end performance has to be limited to ensure that it stays within the requirements for real-time catalytic converter testing. So realistically, the top-end speed is probably going to be around 85 miles an hour, maybe on a good day 90. That's going to be a bit of a barrier in persuading Western customers to fork out maybe another £1,000 for this model. But what they have done is substantially increase the torque. Now this is important, especially on the slower Indian roads where the extremities of performance can rarely be tested, because the figures suggest, from a standing start to, 40, 50 miles an hour, the CB500 could well rival the performance of the 650 twins from Royal Enfield, which makes it more attractive, especially if it's at a lower price than the 650 twins, because it's an air-cooled single. And Royal Enfield, when they cancelled the Classic and Bullet 500, they didn't replace it. They took the easy route, the path of least resistance, and just utilised the 650 twin engine, which put the price up and deprived Indian owners of the sort of romantic, much-loved essence of a 500 single-cc bike. The CB500 puts the possibility of ownership of that sort of bike back on the table. Now, for the Western market, this might be enough to sell this bike, and it might not. I really don't know, but the vibes that I'm getting from people is that it's going to be a far easier sell and a far cheaper proposition to still make a water-cooled twin version for the West. It's going to be a far better financial proposition to simply alter manufacturing processes either in Thailand or Japan to build a GB500 using the 471cc water-cooled engine, and it'll have far better performance that is more suited to Western customers. Because the West's love affair with an air-cooled single-cylinder 500 just isn't as strong as that of India. At the end of the day, Honda know their onions. They didn't get to be the biggest motorcycle manufacturer in the world by accident. We're just going to have to wait and see which direction they take there. Now, this isn't going to destroy Royal Enfield in India. They've already got a huge loyal following, but make no mistake, Honda manufacture motorcycles to a factor of 19 compared to each motorcycle that Royal Enfield kicks out of the factory door. They've got enormous financial resources available to them, and they can afford to bring out models that are essentially loss leaders, i.e. a production of motorcycles that either don't make any profit or perhaps are even sold at a loss. And it's believed that this is the same scenario that's going on with the GB350S in Europe and the UK. They're made and sold in limited numbers. That's intentional. For a start, they don't want to lose too much money, so they keep a tight control over how many models they sell. But this has another effect on customers. Psychologically, it makes that bike more desirable because it's more difficult to get hold of. People are prepared to wait because they've got Honda's superior build quality and engineering at a bargain basement price, so waiting lists are formed. And since the GB350S was released in the UK early last year, it instantly demoted Royal Enfield sales of their 350 series bikes. Now, the timing of that created a perfect storm for Royal Enfield, because Royal Enfield had just pre-registered enormous numbers of bikes in December 2024. They say it was because of the Euro 5 regulations coming into force on the 1st of January, but to me that doesn't ring true, because the government does allow a 1-year amnesty to move those bikes on, so there was no real need for them to do that. The general consensus seems to be that Royal Enfield did this intentionally to artificially inflate sales figures for the 2024 sales period, so that they could boast record sales for that year. But this turned out to be a bit of an own goal for them. It resulted in, the GB350 being released just a few weeks later, and all of a sudden these pre-registered bikes that they thought they'd be able to get rid of cheap quickly didn't move. In fact, some of them are still on offer. Now, the result is that since then, Royal Enfield has had to introduce some very attractive interest rates. They've had to discount bikes quite heavily, and they've also had to include some accessory packs on the bikes free of charge in an attempt to get them moving. This puts an enormous financial burden on Royal Enfield. It also puts unreasonable demands on the dealerships, because they've got unsold inventory sitting on the showroom floors, which limits their ability to be able to buy in new inventory, with the result that some of them have simply ditched the Royal Enfield franchise, or sadly have gone into liquidation. We also had the introduction of the 350 Bantam some 6 or 5 months earlier. We've got the Triumph 400 singles, which have also taken big chunks out of Royal Enfield's sales here in the UK, which has effectively relegated what was once a very successful range of Royal Enfield 350s to 4th place. And on top of that, the sort of death of dealerships in the north of the UK means that their ability to sell has been restricted even further. Now, Siddhartha Lal did a fantastic job of rejuvenating the Royal Enfield brand from 2001, but what a lot of people don't realise is that he stepped out of the role of CEO for Royal Enfield in 2019 and was replaced by someone else. Now, his successor actually did a pretty good job of continuing Sid's legacy, but he also stepped out of the role in 2022 and again was replaced. And it was at that point that I started to voice concerns about the direction that Royal Enfield was going in. It's a matter of historical record that I've been saying for the last few years. Royal Enfield is only killing it in this sector for as long as it's the only company occupying that sector. And the landscape has completely changed now. The current CEO has changed the brand from what used to be a brand for motorcyclists to a lifestyle brand, just another lifestyle brand. Now, sure enough, that has brought some new customers in that probably formerly wouldn't have bought Royal Enfield motorcycles, but at the same time it's chased a lot of loyal fans away. Royal Enfield's failed to sort out its parts distribution network, leaving some customers and dealerships stranded and frustrated. And once those customers has moved over to ownership of Honda and everything that brings with it, they're unlikely to get them back. All Honda had to do was sit back and wait for the right time to move in, and that's exactly what they did with the CB500S. And in India, this is exactly what they're doing with CB500. It's phase 2 of a Scorched Earth project aimed at squeezing Royal Enfield sales by putting just a little bit of pressure on Royal Enfield's domestic market. They're making it even harder for them to continue in foreign markets. Now, I know to some people this might seem like cheating, it might seem underhand or dishonest on Honda's part, but this is just normal corporate business practice, and it plays out all over the world in all walks of business and commerce every single day. That's how you climb to the top and stay there. Now, the CB500, I've got to say, is a lovely looking bike. It is so 1970s in design, but it's been a relatively cheap project for Honda. They've not had to do an awful lot of work to bring this bike out. And at the same time, it's not competing with any of Honda's larger bikes in India, because there aren't really any. Its main sales advantage is that it's a 500cc single-cylinder air-cooled engine, which cashes on the Indian motorcyclist's psyche, with superior performance and quality to all the 350s on the Indian market, but it can also give the 650 twins a run for the money. They don't have to pitch it as a loss leader, it just needs to be appropriately priced above the 350s and appropriately priced below the 650s to be a relative winner. And as I say, they're not looking at obliterating Royal Enfield here. What they're looking at doing is squeezing its sales. Royal Enfield left itself wide open by discontinuing the 500cc models and not replacing them. As I say, I've still got my reservations as to whether this is a viable option for the Western market. But if Honda plays the same game that it has done with the CB350S, keeping numbers tight and selling it as a loss leader, they can appropriately position it between bikes like the CL500 and the GB350S for potentially something like £4,800. But with a higher build quality than the Indian model, along with superior parts like tyres, brakes and electronics. But if they do, there's still a lot of work to do, so I wouldn't count on that happening next week or even next year. It's quite a steep hill to climb. But knowing what this bike is, some of the Indian press are already dubbing it with the headlines that it's a Royal Enfield killer, and I think that's exactly what it's intended to be. It's a cat that's been thrown in among the pigeons. A market disruptor like the GB350S. Like with Triumph, Meriden back in the 1960s, Royal Enfield's just churned out a stream of parts bin specials until the last couple of models, you know, the classic 650 and the Bullet 650, instead of being met with adoration, have just been met by a shoulder shrug. Royal Enfield fatigue is well and truly set in, and Honda is exploiting it. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. Right, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I do appreciate it. Please leave a like, hype this video and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. I will be back next week, so until then, ride safely and I'll see you soon.